The night air across the Tunisian wasteland hung thick and motionless, the kind of stillness that makes soldiers uneasy because it means something is coming. Scattered along a rocky ridgeline near a place called El Guetar, American troops huddled inside their half-tracks and improvised fighting vehicles, peering into darkness that seemed to pulse with hidden danger. The men were nervous, fingers drumming against steel, throats dry despite the water in their canteens. They could feel it before they heard it, that low trembling in the earth that signalled armour on the move. Then came the sound, distant at first, but growing louder with each passing second, the unmistakable grinding roar of tank engines echoing across the desert floor. The German 10th Panzer Division was coming, and the ground itself seemed to announce their arrival with tremors that ran through the soles of boots and up into churning stomachs. When the moon broke through the clouds, its pale light revealed what everyone had been dreading. Dark shapes materialized out of the gloom, moving with mechanical precision, their hulls catching the moonlight in dull gleams. Panzers, dozens of them, rolling forward in formation like some unstoppable tide of steel and violence. Their cannons jutted forward, long barrels searching for targets, and the sight of them advancing together was enough to make even seasoned soldiers question whether they had enough firepower to stop what was bearing down on them. Inside one of the American vehicles, a makeshift contraption known as an M3 gun motor carriage, a young gunner sat pressed against the breech of a French 75mm gun that had been hastily bolted onto the bed of an open half-track. His hands were slick with sweat despite the coolness of the desert night, and dirt streaked his face where he had wiped away the moisture. He had spent weeks training for this exact scenario, listening to instructors tell him that his weapon was the answer to enemy armour, the tool that would stop the German war machine in its tracks. But now, staring out at those approaching silhouettes, watching them grow larger and more menacing with every heartbeat, he could not shake the creeping doubt that whispered through his mind. Could this really work? Was this thin-skinned vehicle with its exposed gun really enough to face down those monsters? The command to fire cut through the tension like a blade. Muzzle flashes erupted along the American line, one after another, tearing holes in the darkness. The French 75s barked and bucked, their recoil slamming through the lightweight frames of the half-tracks. Shells streaked across the intervening distance and struck German armour with varying results. Some found weak points and penetrated, sending panzers up in gouts of flame that turned night into day for brief, horrible moments. Others sparked harmlessly off sloped plates, the rounds deflecting into the sand without effect. The German tanks did not falter for long. Return fire came swiftly and devastatingly. Shells screamed through the air and slammed into the American positions, tearing through the thin hulls of vehicles that offered almost no protection against such firepower. Men scrambled from burning wrecks, their uniforms smoking, faces blackened, diving for whatever cover they could find as the defensive line wavered and threatened to break. For several terrifying minutes, it seemed as though the entire position might collapse into chaos and rout. Yet somehow, impossibly, the tide began to turn. The concentrated American fire, combined with sheer desperate determination, started to exact a toll. More German tanks erupted in flames, their crews bailing out or trapped inside as ammunition cooked off. The panzer advance slowed, then stalled, then began to pull back. When the shooting finally stopped and the smoke started to clear, the battlefield was littered with wreckage. 38 German tanks lay disabled or destroyed across the valley floor, their hulks still smouldering as dawn approached. But victory had come at a brutal cost. 21 American tank destroyers were gone, blown apart or burned out, their crews dead or wounded. The survivors sat in shocked silence, staring at the carnage, trying to process what they had just endured. This engagement was merely the opening chapter of a much longer and bloodier story. To grasp why the United States military had committed itself to these vulnerable machines, why it had placed so much faith in vehicles that seemed almost designed to get their crews killed, you have to go back further, back to where the entire concept was born. You have to return to the late 1930s, to a time when the world was watching a new form of warfare emerge with terrifying speed and efficiency. In the autumn of 1939, German armoured columns smashed through Poland with a velocity that stunned military observers everywhere. Entire armies crumbled in a matter of days. Cities that had stood for centuries fell in hours. The tactics were revolutionary, concentrating tanks and mechanised infantry on narrow fronts, punching deep into enemy territory before defenders could organise an effective response, then fanning out to encircle and destroy whatever remained. The Poles fought bravely, but found themselves overwhelmed by a form of combat for which they had no adequate answer. Less than a year later, the same terrible drama played out in France. The nation that had dominated European warfare for centuries, the country that had built the Maginot Line specifically to prevent another German invasion, collapsed in a matter of weeks. Fortifications that were supposed to be impregnable were bypassed or reduced. Armies that had trained for years to fight the last war found themselves outmaneuvered and outfought by an enemy that had mastered the next one. For American military planners watching these catastrophes unfold from across the Atlantic, the lesson was impossible to ignore and deeply unsettling. The tank, which had been born in the trenches of the First World War as a tool to break through static defences, had evolved into something far more dangerous. In German hands, concentrated in dedicated panzer divisions and supported by dive bombers and mechanised infantry, it had become the spearhead of a new kind of warfare that seemed nearly unstoppable. Traditional methods of dealing with enemy armour, heavy artillery pieces laboriously hauled into position and dug into the ground, towed anti-tank guns pulled by trucks or horses, all of it seemed hopelessly inadequate against the speed and fury of blitzkrieg. By the time defenders recognised where the main thrust was coming and moved their guns into position, the panzers had already broken through and were racing toward objectives miles behind the front lines. The question that haunted every war college, every planning session, every strategic discussion was simple and terrifying. How do you stop an armoured breakthrough once it has begun? How do you counter an enemy who can concentrate overwhelming force at a single point, smash through your defences, and then exploit the gap before you even realise what has happened? Out of this fear and uncertainty, a new doctrine began to take shape. Instead of relying on static defences that could be bypassed or overwhelmed, instead of trying to position heavy guns in advance and hoping the enemy attacked where you expected, the American army would create mobile units dedicated entirely to hunting and destroying enemy tanks. These units would not be tied down by the needs of infantry, would not be burdened with holding ground or supporting multiple roles. They would be specialists, predators designed to hunt the most dangerous prey on the battlefield. They would move with speed, strike from unexpected angles, and vanish before the enemy could retaliate effectively. The concept was tested during the Louisiana Maneuvers of 1941, massive military exercises that sprawled across thousands of square miles and involved hundreds of thousands of troops. Improvised tank destroyer units, cobbled together from available vehicles and weapons, faced off against mock-armoured forces in simulated combat. To the surprise of many observers, these experimental units performed remarkably well. They ambushed enemy columns, shifted positions rapidly, and racked up impressive kill counts in the war games. Critics pointed out that the rules had been adjusted to favour the destroyers, that real combat would be far less forgiving, but the impression left on senior leadership was powerful and lasting. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, who commanded Army ground forces and wielded enormous influence over doctrine and organisation, became the most vocal champion of the tank destroyer concept. To him, this was the answer America had been searching for, a flexible and aggressive counter to the armoured juggernaut that had conquered Europe. Under his patronage and with his full support, the tank destroyer force was officially established as a separate branch with its own command structure, its own training facilities, its own identity within the Army. A sprawling complex rose from the dusty Texas landscape at Fort Hood, where thousands of men would learn the specialized skills needed to hunt tanks. They drilled endlessly on tactics that emphasized speed and aggression, on firing from ambush positions, on the importance of shooting first and relocating immediately. The ambitions grew larger with each passing month. Initial plans called for more than 200 battalions, an enormous commitment of manpower and resources. By the end of 1942, 53 battalions had already been activated and were training for deployment, representing more than 40,000 men whose sole purpose would be destroying enemy armor. American newspapers picked up the story and ran with it, painting pictures of a new branch that would blunt the Nazi war machine, that would make the Desert Foxes and Panzer generals think twice before launching their armored columns against American forces. But even as this massive organization took shape, even as tens of thousands of men learned their new trade and equipment began rolling off assembly lines, questions lingered in the minds of thoughtful officers. Could vehicles with thin armor really survive in direct confrontation with the heaviest German tanks? Could a force designed and trained for a specific type of battle, the massed armored breakthrough, adapt if the enemy refused to cooperate and fought differently than expected? Could the doctrine survive contact with the brutal reality of modern war? Still, the momentum was impossible to stop. The nation that had entered the 1930s woefully behind in armoured warfare, that had watched with alarm as Germany rearmed and retooled its military, now proclaimed confidently that it had found the solution. The tank destroyer was not merely a weapon system or a collection of vehicles. It was a promise to the American people and to allies around the world, a guarantee that when German panzers came rolling forward, they would meet their match. Promises, though, are only proven or broken in the crucible of actual combat. Theory is tested by reality, doctrine by the chaos of battle. Soon enough, across the burning sands of North Africa and later in the hedgerows of France and the frozen forests of Belgium, that promise would face its ultimate examination. The birth of the tank destroyer as an actual fighting force, as opposed to a concept on paper, was marked not by elegant engineering or sophisticated design, but by desperate improvisation. The first vehicles to carry the name were essentially weapons platforms cobbled together in workshops and depots, the army racing against time to give physical form to its ambitious new doctrine. The M6 represented the crudest possible approach to the problem. Engineers took a 37mm anti-tank gun, a weapon already showing its inadequacy against modern armour, and simply bolted it onto the bed of a 3/4-ton truck. The result was open, unarmoured, and frankly absurd in appearance. Soldiers who trained with these contraptions joked grimly that the only thing the M6 was likely to destroy was the morale of its own crew. The weapon offered almost no protection, the platform was unstable, and the whole arrangement looked more like something from a cartoon than a serious military vehicle. Yet for a brief period, this ungainly creation represented the cutting edge of American tank destroyer development, carrying with it all the hopes and fears of a nation preparing for war. The M3 gun motor carriage represented a slight improvement, though only slight. Built on the chassis of the M3 half-track, a vehicle that combined front wheels with rear tracks for improved mobility, it mounted a French 75mm gun on top of the hull. The weapon itself was proven and powerful, having served in the trenches of the previous war, but the mounting was awkward and the vehicle top-heavy. The gun stuck up above the sides of the half-track like a sore thumb, making concealment difficult and presenting an easy target for enemy gunners. The armour, such as it was, could stop rifle bullets and shrapnel, but would crumple like paper under anti-tank fire. Still, the M3 could move quickly across rough terrain, could deliver a powerful punch when it fired, and could theoretically withdraw to a new position before enemy artillery bracketed its location. It was crude, it was vulnerable, but it embodied the core principle of the doctrine: mobility over protection, speed over armour. By 1942, these stopgap vehicles were already seeing action. In the deserts of North Africa, where Rommel's Afrika Korps had established a fearsome reputation, crews from the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion found themselves facing veteran German panzer units at a place called El Ghetar. They fought using the tactics they had learned in training, positioning themselves behind ridge lines and terrain features, dashing forward to fire a few rounds, then pulling back to new positions before return fire could find them. Against the experienced 10th Panzer Division, they scored hits, leaving dozens of enemy tanks burning across the battlefield. But the engagement cost them dearly. More than 2/3 of their own vehicles were destroyed or disabled, their crews killed or wounded. The lesson was written in blood and twisted metal. Courage and speed could win battles, but only at a terrible price when you were fighting from vehicles that offered almost no protection against enemy fire. The army needed something better, something purpose-built rather than improvised. That answer arrived in the form of the M10 Wolverine, and it represented a genuine leap forward. Engineers started with the proven chassis of the M4 Sherman tank, which provided decent mobility and reasonable reliability, but instead of mounting a turret designed for general-purpose combat, they fitted a new pentagonal turret housing a long-barreled 76mm gun. The result was a vehicle that looked purposeful and deadly, with a gun capable of penetrating most German armour at reasonable ranges. General Motors and Ford tooled up their factories and began churning out M10s by the thousands, more than 6,000, eventually rolling off production lines that operated around the clock. For the men who climbed into these machines for the first time, the Wolverine felt like a significant improvement over what had come before. It was stronger, better armed, more likely to survive a fight with enemy armour. The gun could reach out and touch targets at impressive distances, and the vehicle could move across battlefield terrain without breaking down every few miles. Yet the M10 carried its own set of compromises and weaknesses. The armour was thin compared to a real tank, barely enough to stop heavy machine gun fire, nowhere near adequate to resist armour-piercing rounds from enemy tanks. The turret, while larger and more functional than anything on the earlier vehicles, had to be traversed by hand, the crew laboriously cranking it around to face new targets. In a fast-moving engagement where seconds mattered, this manual traverse could mean the difference between getting off the first shot and being hit before you could return fire. Most critically, the turret was open-topped, lacking the overhead protection that would shield the crew from artillery airbursts, from shrapnel raining down, from small arms fire coming from elevated positions. For the 5 men crammed inside, every battle was a calculated risk. They had better visibility than their counterparts in enclosed tanks, could spot threats earlier and react more quickly, but that same openness left them exposed to dangers that tank crews never worried about. Every tree burst, every artillery shell detonating overhead, every machine gunner in a second-story window represented a potential death sentence. Then came the Hellcat, and it was something genuinely new. When Buick unveiled the M18 in 1944, crews who saw it for the first time could hardly believe it was meant for tank destroyer service. It was sleek, almost elegant, built around a powerful radial aircraft engine that gave it astonishing speed for an armoured vehicle. The M18 could race across open ground at 50 miles per hour, making it one of the fastest tracked vehicles in the world. Speed became its primary defence, the ability to appear suddenly, fire, and vanish before the enemy could respond. Crews who transitioned from the ponderous M10 to the nimble Hellcat loved it immediately, praising its handling and agility. But that speed came at a cost that made some men blanch when they learned the details. The armour was barely an inch thick in most places, essentially proof only against small arms and light shrapnel. Against a German 88mm gun, against the main cannon of a Tiger or Panther, the Hellcat might as well have been made from cardboard. A direct hit would punch straight through and detonate inside, killing the crew instantly. Yet the Hellcat embodied the tank destroyer doctrine in its purest form. It was not meant to slug it out in a stand-up fight. It was meant to strike from ambush, to hit hard and fast, to be somewhere else before the enemy could bring their superior firepower to bear. Finally came the M36 Jackson, arriving late in the war, but packing the most formidable punch of any American tank destroyer. It mounted a 90mm gun, the same weapon used in the heaviest American anti-aircraft batteries, now turned horizontal and aimed at enemy armor. That gun could penetrate the frontal armor of a Panther at combat ranges, could crack open even a Tiger if the shot was well placed. Its shells reached out thousands of meters, giving American crews the ability to engage German heavy tanks from positions of relative safety. For the first time, men climbing into an American tank destroyer felt they possessed a weapon that could match the deadliest machines the Germans could field. The M36 represented the culmination of the evolutionary process, the final answer to the question of how much firepower you could mount on a tank destroyer chassis. Together, these vehicles traced the arc of American desperation and ingenuity. From the absurd M6 to the purposeful M10, from the lightning-fast Hellcat to the hard-hitting Jackson, each model represented lessons learned and compromises made. Each carried within its design the fundamental tension of the doctrine: firepower and speed purchased at the cost of protection, offensive capability gained by accepting vulnerability. As battalions trained with these machines, as crews learned their strengths and weaknesses, as maintenance personnel figured out how to keep them running under field conditions, the stage was set for their ultimate test. The real question, the one that haunted every thoughtful officer and every crew member who understood what they were climbing into, was whether these vehicles would hold up when the full weight of German armor came crashing down, whether the doctrine would survive its collision with battlefield reality. When the 1st Battalions boarded transport ships bound for North Africa, when they crossed the Atlantic dodging submarine wolf packs and wondering what awaited them on the other side, the men carried more questions than answers. They had trained hard, had absorbed the doctrine, had been told repeatedly that they represented the sharp end of the spear against enemy armor. But training in Texas dust and Louisiana mud was one thing. Actual combat against veteran German tankers was something else entirely. As their ships approached the African coast and men gathered on deck to catch their first glimpse of the war zone, the abstract theories and classroom lessons began to feel very distant and not particularly reassuring. Life in the early North African campaigns was harsh in ways that training had not fully prepared them for. The desert heat during the day was overwhelming, turning the insides of vehicles into ovens, baking men in their own sweat and making metal too hot to touch with bare hands. Nights brought bitter cold that seeped into bones and made sleep difficult despite exhaustion. Their open-topped vehicles offered no shelter from sandstorms that seemed to materialize out of nowhere, coating everything in grit that worked its way into every mechanism, every weapon, every piece of equipment. Rain, when it came, turned encampments into seas of mud where vehicles bogged down and men slogged through muck that sucked at their boots. Many of these soldiers were young men fresh from American towns and cities, mechanics and farm boys and college students suddenly thrust into an alien landscape where even the environment seemed hostile to their existence. Their first missions were tentative, feeling out the realities of combat, learning that war rarely matched the scenarios from training exercises. Instead of the dramatic ambushes against massed German tank formations that doctrine had prepared them for, they found themselves in supporting roles, providing fire support for infantry advances, shelling distant positions suspected of holding enemy troops, covering flanks during movements. The M3s and M10s spent more time lobbing high-explosive shells at machine gun nests and fortified positions than engaging in tank versus tank duels. Each mission brought a strange mixture of relief that they were not facing panzers in direct combat and frustration that they were not doing what they had been specifically trained to do. The paradox of their existence became apparent quickly. They were hunters designed for prey that rarely appeared, specialists waiting for a type of battle that might never come. Yet the tension never truly disappeared. Every patrol, every advance, every movement carried the possibility that around the next hill or behind the next ridge, German armor might be waiting. Crews rehearsed their battle drills constantly during lulls in the fighting, going through the motions again and again until the sequence became automatic. Spot the target, traverse the gun, load the right type of ammunition, fire, observe the impact, immediately prepare to move to a new position. Gunners obsessively cleaned their optics, knowing that spotting the enemy first could mean survival. Loaders arranged ammunition within easy reach, making sure they could grab the right shell in the heat of combat without fumbling. Drivers learned every quirk of their vehicles, every sound the engine made, every feel of the transmission. They understood at a visceral level that when battle came, when panzers appeared on the horizon, they would have seconds to react, and those seconds would determine whether they lived or died. When not in action, the men lived the universal experience of soldiers throughout history, waiting. They wrote letters home to sweethearts and parents and friends, trying to describe experiences that could not really be explained to people who had never faced combat. They played endless games of cards under the glow of lanterns, argued passionately about sports and politics and girls, sought any distraction from the knowledge of what they might face tomorrow or the day after. But beneath the laughter and the mundane conversations, an undercurrent of dread flowed constantly. They had heard stories about German armour, tales that grew with each retelling. Tigers that could shrug off direct hits that would destroy any American tank. Panthers with guns that could kill at ranges where return fire was impossible. Crews wondered privately, in the quiet hours before dawn, whether their thin-skinned machines would have any chance at all when those monsters finally appeared. As the North African campaign ground toward its conclusion and the war shifted north into Italy, the reality of combat pressed closer and became more intimate. Mountain roads twisted precariously along cliff faces, often too narrow for vehicles to turn around, leaving destroyers vulnerable and trapped if they encountered the enemy. Tank destroyer battalions crawled through villages that had been reduced to rubble by artillery and air bombardment, their engines echoing off shattered walls, their crews scanning windows and rooftops for threats. The doctrine of open-field ambushes, of using speed and mobility to strike and fade, seemed increasingly theoretical in terrain that channeled movement and limited maneuver. Yet paradoxically, their role expanded and became more varied. They served as mobile artillery when infantry needed fire support. They became strong points when defensive positions needed reinforcement. They were assault guns when fortified positions needed to be reduced. The specialization that had defined their training gave way to improvisation and adaptation. By the summer of 1944, the men who had survived North Africa and Italy, who had buried friends and watched their vehicles burn and somehow come through it all, found themselves in England staring across the English Channel at the coast of France. Operation Overlord loomed on the horizon like an approaching storm, and every soldier knew that Normandy would dwarf everything they had experienced so far. The tension in the tank destroyer battalions was electric and palpable. Some men spoke with bravado, repeating the stories of their successes, talking confidently about what they would do to German armour. Others kept their fears locked away, maintaining stoic expressions while privately wondering if they would survive what was coming. All of them felt the weight of expectation pressing down, the knowledge that the liberation of Europe would succeed or fail based on battles fought in the hedgerows and fields and towns of France. The voyage across the Channel was heavy with anticipation that bordered on dread. As landing craft pitched and rolled in the surf, engines growling, crews clutched the steel sides of their vehicles and tried to keep their stomachs settled. They could hear the distant thunder of naval bombardment, could see smoke rising from the beaches, could imagine what awaited them when the ramps dropped and they drove into that chaos. Every man knew they were about to enter a maelstrom where hedgerows might conceal anti-tank guns, where every field could hide a panzer, where the enemy had months to prepare defences and knew the terrain intimately. Yet mixed with the fear was a kind of resolve that came from experience and shared hardship. These were no longer the uncertain recruits who had trained at Fort Hood years before. They were veterans who had seen combat, who had learned hard lessons in Tunisia and Italy, who understood that their machines were flawed but also knew how to fight from them effectively. They had buried friends, had endured the furnace of desert warfare and the grinding attrition of mountain combat. They knew the stakes of failure and understood that survival often came down to speed, to cunning, to the courage required to fire first when every instinct screamed to take cover. The road to Normandy had transformed them into something harder than any doctrine could have predicted, more resilient than theory had accounted for. They were tank destroyer men now, shaped by fire and loss into a unique breed. Half hopeful that their training and experience would see them through, half fatalistic about the odds they faced, they prepared to drive into the green hell of France where the doctrine would face its severest test yet. The hedgerows of Normandy were unlike anything American tankers had encountered before, and they turned out to be a nightmare for mechanized warfare. These were not the neat rows of bushes that lined roads back home. They were ancient earthen walls, thick and high, topped with centuries of tangled vegetation that had grown into almost impenetrable barriers. The lanes between them were narrow corridors where visibility extended perhaps 20 or 30 yards before the next turn, the next blind corner, the next potential ambush site. For tank destroyer crews rolling into this maze in the summer of 1944, every metre of advance was fraught with danger. Around any corner could be the dark muzzle of an anti-tank gun positioned perfectly to catch vehicles as they emerged into a killing zone. Behind any hedgerow could crouch a panther, hull down and nearly invisible, waiting for American armour to expose itself. The open plains doctrine that had seemed so promising in Louisiana, manoeuvres felt utterly inadequate in this claustrophobic green labyrinth where the enemy held every advantage of position and preparation. On the 11th of July, near the battered city of St. Lô, the test came in full force. At first light, the Panzer Lehr Division, one of the elite German armoured formations, launched a counterattack aimed at relieving pressure on the crumbling German defensive line. These were veteran troops in well-maintained vehicles, led by officers who had learned their trade on the Eastern Front and in the desert, men who knew exactly how to use terrain and surprise to maximum effect. In the small village of Le Désert, M10 Wolverines from the 799th and 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalions had positioned themselves during the night, their commanders gambling on where the German thrust would come. Their turrets creaked as gunners traversed them slowly, searching the hedgerows for any sign of movement, nerves stretched taut as wire. The wait was agonizing. Every sound might be approaching armor, every shadow might conceal death. Fingers hovered near triggers, ready to fire at the first confirmed target, but aware that shooting too soon might give away positions prematurely. The ground began to tremble, subtle at first, but building rapidly into a vibration that could be felt through the soles of boots and the seats of vehicles. Then the sound arrived, the unmistakable roar of multiple tank engines running at combat speed, growing louder with each passing second. Like phantoms materializing from the morning mist that still clung to the low ground, panthers began to appear. Dark, angular shapes emerging from the hedgerows, their guns traversing as they searched for targets, moving with the confidence of predators that had dominated battlefields from Russia to North Africa. The American crews felt their hearts hammering, adrenaline flooding systems, the moment of truth finally arriving after hours of tense waiting. The engagement that followed was brutal in its intensity and mercifully short. From positions carefully chosen during the night, the Wolverines opened fire. The crack of 76mm guns split the morning air. Shells streaked across the intervening ground and struck German armour with varying results. One Panther took a direct hit to the side and erupted into flames, black smoke pouring from hatches as the crew bailed out in panic. Another absorbed multiple hits to its frontal armour, the rounds sparking harmlessly off the sloped plates, and kept advancing as though nothing had happened. American crews frantically reloaded, muscles moving through practiced motions, but time seemed to stretch and contract in the chaos of combat. Every second loading felt like an eternity while Panthers closed the distance. Then the sky erupted with a different kind of violence as Allied fighter bombers screamed down from above, their pilots responding to pre-arranged signals or simply recognizing the tactical situation. Rockets and bombs rained down on the German columns, turning the battlefield into an inferno. Explosions walked through the Panzer-Lehr positions, throwing up fountains of earth and debris, catching vehicles that had been focused on engaging ground targets and could not defend themselves against attack from above. When the smoke finally began to clear and the sounds of battle faded to echoes, 30 German tanks sat silent and broken among the fields around Le Désert. Some were still burning, sending columns of oily smoke into the sky. Others simply sat abandoned, their crews fled or dead. For the tank destroyer battalions, it felt like vindication of everything they had been told, proof that the doctrine could work, that they could stand against the best armour Germany could field. But the price was measured in their own burning wrecks scattered across the battlefield, in the silence where friends had been moments before, in the crews who would never answer another roll call. Victory and loss were inseparable, two sides of a coin that kept turning. Only weeks later, the crucible heated up again at a place called Mortagne. In early August 1944, 4 panzer divisions, representing a massive commitment of German armour that could not be easily replaced, hurled themselves at American lines in a desperate gamble to cut off the Allied breakout from Normandy. The order had come from the top of the German command structure, from the madman running the show in Berlin, demanding that the panzers drive all the way to the coast and split the Allied armies in two. It was a fantasy born of desperation, but the men and machines executing the order were real enough and deadly dangerous. In the pre-dawn darkness and fog that blanketed the battlefield, the 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalion held positions that would prove critical. Their towed 76mm guns, lacking the mobility of self-propelled versions but packing the same punch, had been carefully emplaced in fields and behind hedgerows during the previous day. Crews had dug in, creating firing positions that provided some protection while offering clear fields of fire across likely avenues of approach. The battle that erupted was savage and confused, fought at close ranges in limited visibility, where gunners aimed at muzzle flashes and the shadowy outlines of vehicles glimpsed through the fog. American crews pulled lanyards again and again, the guns recoiling violently with each shot, brass casings piling up around positions as loaders worked frantically to maintain rate of fire. Panthers emerged from the fog like ghosts, their own guns flashing as they engaged targets they could barely see. 14 German tanks died in the killing zone, victims of well-placed shots that found weak points or simply overwhelmed armour through concentrated fire. But 11 American guns went silent, their crews killed or captured, the weapons themselves destroyed by direct hits or overrun when German infantry followed up the armour attacks. Reinforcements arrived as the battle raged, self-propelled M10 and M18 Hellcats racing to the sound of guns, their commanders knowing that if the line broke here, the entire campaign could be jeopardized. Together, towed guns and mobile destroyers blunted the German thrust through firepower and sheer stubborn determination. The battle raged for days as the Germans threw everything they had into the offensive, but Mortagne became a graveyard for panzers rather than the springboard for a counter-offensive. When it ended, the Wehrmacht had suffered losses it could not afford, and the tank destroyers, bloodied but unbroken, had played a crucial role in one of the decisive battles of the Normandy campaign. Farther east and months later, winter arrived with a vengeance in the Ardennes forest. December 1944 brought heavy snow that blanketed the rolling hills and dense woods, muffling sound and reducing visibility. It seemed like a quiet sector, a place to rest divisions that had been mauled in earlier fighting, a place to blood new units before they faced serious combat. Then came the 16th of December, and the quiet shattered into chaos. The Battle of the Bulge began with a massive artillery barrage that tore the night apart, followed by the rumble of armour as Tigers, Panthers and waves of infantry poured through gaps in American lines. The final gamble of the German leader, the last desperate attempt to change the course of the war in the West, was underway. Roads choked with retreating vehicles, villages burned, smoke rose from positions that had been overrun in the initial onslaught. It was here, in the frozen forests and snow-covered fields of Belgium, that tank destroyers would face their greatest trial. At a village called Noville, north of the critical crossroads town of Bastogne, a platoon of M18 Hellcats from the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion found itself in the path of a German armoured column advancing with the confidence of forces that had achieved complete tactical surprise. The air was brittle with cold, so cold that exposed metal burned skin on contact, so cold that weapons needed special care to function reliably. The fields were covered in pristine white snow that would soon be stained red and black. The Hellcats, true to their nature, did not wait in static positions for the enemy to arrive. They charged, their powerful engines roaring, tracks throwing up plumes of snow as they raced across open ground toward the German column. Their crews were exposed to the freezing air in open turrets, eyes streaming from the wind, but their training and experience guided them through the chaos. They struck with the precision of ambush predators that had been waiting for exactly this opportunity, appearing suddenly in positions the Germans had not anticipated, firing rapidly before shifting to new locations. In a single day of brutal fighting, 30 German tanks lay wrecked across the snow around Noville, their hulks burning in the white landscape, black smoke marking each kill. The Hellcats themselves, despite armour that was laughably thin against the weapons they faced, seemed to vanish and reappear with uncanny timing. They struck from one direction, then appeared from another before the Germans could organise an effective response. Their speed was their salvation, allowing them to survive in a battle where being static meant being dead. Farther north, at the town of Saint-Vith, another critical road junction that the Germans needed to maintain the momentum of their offensive, the 814th Tank Destroyer Battalion fought a desperate delaying action that would become legend. Their M36 Jacksons, armed with the powerful 90mm guns, engaged Panthers at ranges that exceeded 2,000 metres. Each shot was a thunderclap that echoed across the frozen landscape. Each hit a brilliant flash against dark armour. The crews fought from positions they knew could not be held indefinitely, buying time with their lives, trading space for the hours that reinforcements would need to arrive. Casualties were staggering, with half the battalion's strength lost in the brutal fighting. But 30 Panthers lay destroyed when the battalion finally withdrew, and they had held the critical junction long enough for the defensive line to stabilise. Their sacrifice changed the trajectory of the German offensive, forcing delays and disrupting timetables that had been planned to the hour. Even the older M10 Wolverines, considered obsolete by this late stage of the war and slated for replacement, found their moment of glory in the snow. At Elsenborn Ridge, a high ground position that anchored the northern shoulder of the Bulge, the 644th Tank Destroyer Battalion faced wave after wave of German assaults. For 2 days they battled from frozen emplacements, their guns hammering at tigers that seemed almost invulnerable but could still be killed with precise shots or concentrated fire. 17 German tanks were destroyed before the enemy finally gave up and redirected their efforts elsewhere. The ridge held, and with it the entire northern flank of the American position, containing the Bulge and preventing it from becoming the breakthrough that German planners had envisioned. Yet glory came with a butcher's bill that was horrifying when tallied after the battle ended. In the Ardennes campaign alone, 119 tank destroyers were lost. 86 of them were towed guns, those immobile weapons that could not withdraw when positions were overrun, whose crews often fought to the last moment before being killed or captured. But the statistics told another story that commanders studied carefully. In that same campaign, tank destroyer battalions accounted for more than 300 confirmed German tank kills. For every destroyer lost, 2 or sometimes 3 enemy tanks were left burning in the snow. The exchange rate, cold and brutal as it was, suggested that the doctrine had value even if it came at a terrible human cost. These battles across France and Belgium revealed a truth that doctrine had not fully anticipated. The massed armoured breakthroughs that had terrified planners, the nightmare scenarios of hundreds of panzers punching through and racing to strategic objectives, those battles never materialised in the way theory had predicted. Instead, tank destroyers found their worth in improvisation and flexibility, in rushing to plug gaps in the line, in reinforcing positions under pressure, in providing mobile firepower wherever the crisis of the moment demanded. They served as fire support when infantry needed heavy guns. They became mobile artillery when targets needed to be reduced. They were sometimes even static bunkers when defensive positions needed to be held. They were not the silver bullet that doctrine had promised, the specialized counter to a specific threat. But in the crucibles of Saint-Lô and Mortain and Bastogne and Saint-Vith, they proved something perhaps more valuable. They demonstrated that thin-skinned hunters, when manned by determined crews who understood their limitations and exploited their strengths, could defy even the most fearsome predators of steel that German industry could produce. And yet, even as the smoke cleared and spring approached, as Germany's final desperate gambles failed and the end came into sight, questions began to circulate through higher headquarters. If the tank destroyers had fought so fiercely, if their kill ratios were impressive and their crews had proven themselves time and again, why then was the army beginning to reconsider the entire concept? Why were doubts creeping in even as victory approached? When the guns finally fell silent across Europe and soldiers began the difficult process of transitioning from combat to whatever came next, the tank destroyer force found itself in an uncomfortable position. Their combat record was written in undeniable statistics and battlefield reports. Hundreds upon hundreds of enemy tanks knocked out across North Africa and Italy and France and Germany. Countless infantry attacks broken up by timely fire. Desperate defensive positions held long enough for the line to stabilize. Individual units had earned presidential citations and battle streamers. Crews had won medals for actions that ranged from merely brave to almost suicidally courageous. Yet their reputation within the army hierarchy was anything but secure, and the future of the entire branch was increasingly uncertain. In the aftermath of Tunisia, commanders reviewed battle reports and tallied losses and tried to draw lessons from what had happened. They remembered the bravery of the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion, the determination with which those men had faced veteran panzer units. But they also remembered the sight of 2/3 of that battalion's vehicles burning or disabled, the casualty lists that seemed disproportionate to the results achieved. General George Patton, never one to mince words or hide his opinions, dismissed the tank destroyer concept as fundamentally flawed. To him, the idea of lightly armoured vehicles trying to fight heavily armoured tanks was simply nonsense. Tanks should fight tanks, he argued, and the army was wasting resources maintaining a separate branch for a mission that regular armour could perform better. In Italy, the mission creep became impossible to ignore. Tank destroyer battalions found themselves firing thousands upon thousands of high-explosive shells in support of infantry operations, acting less like specialized tank hunters and more like mobile artillery pieces that could be repositioned quickly. Some officers began grumbling privately that the doctrine had failed before it ever truly succeeded, that the massed panzer breakthroughs everyone had feared simply were not happening in the way theory had predicted. The Germans, on the defensive and husbanding their dwindling armour reserves, were not launching the kind of concentrated attacks that tank destroyer doctrine was designed to counter. Instead, they were fighting a defensive campaign that emphasized strong points and delaying actions, using terrain to offset Allied numerical and material superiority. The arrival of improved vehicles like the M18 Hellcat seemed to offer renewed hope. Crews loved the speed and agility, the ability to race across battlefields and strike from unexpected angles. But even admirers had to acknowledge the uncomfortable truth that armour measured in inches rather than feet left the Hellcat vulnerable to weapons ranging from heavy machine guns to the massive cannon mounted on German heavy tanks. In France, soldiers began improvising modifications to address shortcomings that designers had either overlooked or accepted as necessary compromises. Crews piled sandbags onto their vehicles, hoping the added mass would provide some extra protection against shaped charges and high-explosive rounds. They welded spare track links onto hull sides, creating improvised armour that added weight and reduced mobility, but might stop a shell that would otherwise penetrate. They fabricated makeshift covers for open turrets, seeking protection from the shrapnel and small arms fire that rained down during urban fighting. These field modifications were born of necessity, silent admissions that the vehicles as designed were not quite adequate for the realities of combat. By the time the M36 Jackson appeared with its formidable 90mm gun, the tide of war had already turned decisively in favor of the Allies. The Jackson could engage and kill Panthers and even Tigers at respectable ranges, giving American crews a weapon that finally seemed to match the heaviest German armor. But alongside these specialized tank destroyers rolled a new generation of Sherman tanks that had been upgunned with 76mm weapons, the same caliber that had once been unique to the M10 Wolverine. The distinction between tank and tank destroyer was blurring. Both types of vehicles now carried similar weapons. Both were used in combined arms operations. Both supported infantry and engaged enemy armor as opportunities arose. The question being asked more frequently in planning sessions was simple and uncomfortable. Was there truly a need for a separate branch, for dedicated battalions equipped with vehicles that were increasingly similar to modified tanks? In January 1945, the Army issued an order that marked the beginning of the end. Many towed tank destroyer battalions were directed to convert to self-propelled equipment, acknowledging what had become painfully obvious through bitter experience. Immobile guns could not survive on the fluid, fast-moving battlefields of modern war. Crews that could not relocate quickly after firing became targets for counter-battery fire, for airstrikes, for maneuver elements that could pin them in place and destroy them. The move was both practical and symbolic, a quiet retreat from aspects of the original doctrine that had proven unworkable. On battlefields across France and Germany, the men continued doing their jobs with professional competence, fighting through the Siegfried Line fortifications, hammering concrete bunkers with the same guns designed to kill tanks. They stood guard at Remagen when engineers threw a bridge across the Rhine, providing protection against counterattacks that might destroy the invaluable crossing. They fought until the last days of the war, their engines echoing through burning cities, their guns falling silent only when Germany itself surrendered and the shooting finally stopped. But even as victory was being celebrated, as soldiers looked forward to going home and trying to rebuild lives interrupted by war, the fundamental question could not be avoided any longer. The tank destroyer had been conceived as a weapon of necessity, a specialized solution to a nightmare scenario that planners in 1940 and 1941 had believed was inevitable. The sweeping panzer breakthroughs that had conquered Poland and France, the massed armoured attacks that had terrorized Allied commanders, those had not materialized again in the expected form. Germany, battered and increasingly on the defensive throughout 1943 and 1944, no longer had the resources or strategic initiative to launch the kind of concentrated armoured offensives that had characterized Blitzkrieg. The hunters had spent most of the war waiting for prey that appeared only sporadically, adapting to missions they had never been specifically trained for, proving their value through flexibility rather than through execution of doctrine. 3 months after the last shots were fired in Europe, the United States Army made its decision official. The tank destroyer branch was formally dissolved, its separate command structure dismantled, its identity within the military eliminated. Fort Hood, which had trained tens of thousands of men in the specialized skills of tank hunting, shifted its mission to other purposes. The doctrine that had seemed so promising in 1941, that had driven the creation of more than 50 battalions and the production of thousands of specialized vehicles, was quietly shelved. The officers who had championed the concept found their arguments overtaken by events and changing strategic realities. The future, planners declared with confidence, lay not in specialized branches with narrow missions, but in versatile platforms. Main battle tanks that could engage enemy armor, support infantry, reduce fortifications, perform reconnaissance, and adapt to whatever mission the tactical situation demanded. For the men who had crewed those open-topped vehicles, who had endured years of combat in machines that offered minimal protection, the decision was difficult to process. Their battalions had written stories of extraordinary courage across North Africa, through the mountains of Italy, in the hedgerows of France, and amid the snows of Belgium. They had stood and fought when retreat would have been understandable, had achieved kill ratios that compared favourably with any other branch, had earned their place in the history of the war through blood and sacrifice. Yet history seemed determined to view them as a failed experiment, a doctrinal dead end, a concept that had been overtaken by the evolution of armoured warfare before it ever fully matured. The battlefields told a different story if anyone cared to look closely enough. Rows of destroyed panthers and tigers scattered across Europe, testimony carved in blackened steel and shattered armour to the effectiveness of American tank destroyer crews. Individual actions that deserved to be remembered, small unit battles where courage and tactical skill had overcome material disadvantages. But the verdict of institutional memory was already being written, and it was not kind. The tank destroyer, born of fear in the dark days when German victory seemed possible, forged in the fires of desperate battles, would vanish from the order of battle almost as swiftly as it had appeared, leaving behind only memories and lessons learned at terrible cost. The war ended, but echoes of the tank destroyer continued reverberating through military circles even as the branch itself disappeared from organizational charts. Within months of victory, the official dissolution was complete. The battalions were disbanded, their specialized mission eliminated, the men who had served in them reassigned or discharged and sent home to resume civilian lives interrupted by war. It was as if the army wanted to erase the entire experiment, to move past an organizational structure that no longer fit the vision of future warfare. Yet the machines themselves and the hard-won lessons they represented could not be so easily discarded or forgotten. Their story continued in unexpected ways, woven into the larger narrative of how modern militaries learn from experience and adapt to changing realities. In Korea, when war erupted in 1950 and American forces found themselves fighting again less than 5 years after victory in Europe, the distinctive roar of the M36 Jackson was heard once more on battlefields halfway around the world. Against Soviet-built T-34 tanks, the 90mm gun proved just as deadly as it had been against German armour, reminding commanders that reports of the tank destroyer's death had been premature. The Jackson could still kill, could still provide the mobile firepower that fast-moving operations demanded. Its open turret remained a vulnerability, its thin armour still made crews nervous, but the weapon worked, and that was what mattered when Chinese and North Korean armour came rolling south. Across the globe, surplus American tank destroyers found new homes in surprising places. Allied nations rebuilding their militaries in the aftermath of global war received these vehicles through military assistance programs. Countries that could not afford cutting-edge equipment welcomed proven designs that could still perform effectively, even if they were no longer state-of-the-art. On battlefields far removed from their original European theatre, in conflicts large and small, American tank destroyers continued to fight under foreign flags and different national markings. Some served for decades, their longevity proving that the fundamental designs had merit even if the doctrinal framework that spawned them had been abandoned. But perhaps the most important legacy existed not in steel and mechanics, but in lessons absorbed and doctrine refined. The experiment had revealed fundamental truths about military organization and weapons design that would influence thinking for generations to come. Over-specialization, creating units and vehicles dedicated to a single narrow mission, carried enormous risks. When the expected scenario failed to materialize, when the enemy refused to cooperate and fight the way you anticipated, specialized forces could find themselves irrelevant or forced into roles they were not designed for. The German blitzkrieg that had terrified American planners in 1940 and 1941 had never returned in its original form once Germany lost strategic initiative. The nightmare of massed panzer breakthroughs racing deep into Allied rear areas simply did not happen during the campaigns from Normandy to the Rhine. Instead, the struggle became one of attrition and combined arms operations, of infantry and armour and artillery working together in mutually supporting roles, of flexibility and adaptation rather than specialised counters to specific threats. Tank destroyers had survived and proved valuable only because their crews refused to be bound by rigid doctrine, only because commanders were willing to employ them in whatever role the tactical situation demanded. They became fire support when infantry needed it, became mobile anti-tank reserves when breakthrough threatened, became assault guns when fortifications needed reduction. Their usefulness came from adaptability rather than from execution of their designed mission. This lesson was not lost on the officers studying armour development and doctrine in the post-war years. From the ashes of the tank-destroyer branch rose a new concept, that of the main battle tank, a single vehicle type that could perform multiple roles with reasonable effectiveness. One platform that could fight enemy armour when necessary, support infantry when required, operate independently or as part of combined arms teams. The M48, the M60, eventually the M1 Abrams, all represented this philosophy of versatility over specialization, of creating weapons systems that could adapt to whatever missions arose rather than designing for narrow scenarios. The human legacy was perhaps the most poignant and the most often overlooked. Thousands of men had served in tank destroyer battalions, had faced enemy fire from vehicles that offered minimal protection, had learned to trust in speed and firepower and tactical skill because armour was not an option. They had developed unique bonds forged in shared danger, had lost friends to German guns, had seen things that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. When they returned home after the war, they found that their service was often forgotten or minimised, that the tank destroyer battalions were being written out of popular history in favour of more conventional branches. Reunions grew smaller with each passing year as veterans aged and died, taking with them memories of battles fought and friends lost. Historians argued among themselves about the value and effectiveness of the tank destroyer force, some dismissing it as a doctrinal failure that wasted resources and cost lives unnecessarily, others pointing to impressive statistics and arguing that the concept worked better than critics admitted. The truth, as is so often the case, lay somewhere in the middle ground between extremes. The tank destroyers were flawed, their vulnerabilities real and costly, their doctrine based on assumptions that did not fully match battlefield reality. But they were also effective when properly employed, their kill ratios impressive, their contribution to victory measurable and significant. They succeeded not because the doctrine was perfect, but because the men who crewed them were courageous and adaptable, because tactical commanders learned to use them effectively despite their limitations. Most of all, the tank destroyer left a mark on how the American military thought about armoured warfare and weapons development. The lessons learned in Tunisia and Normandy and the Ardennes, paid for in blood and burning vehicles, shaped decisions about tank design and doctrine for decades afterward. The recognition that mobility and firepower mattered enormously, but that protection could not be completely sacrificed, that crews needed to survive if vehicles were to be effective over sustained campaigns, influenced the evolution of American armour through the Cold War and beyond. The understanding that specialization carried risks, that versatility might matter more than optimization for a single role, became embedded in procurement decisions and organizational planning. Perhaps that represents the truest legacy of the tank destroyer, not that it was the perfect weapon or the ideal organizational structure, but that it demonstrated how determination and courage could compensate for material shortcomings, how adaptation mattered more than rigid adherence to doctrine, how even flawed concepts could contribute to victory when executed by skilled and brave men. The tank destroyers were not eternal, were not perfect, but for a critical period in history they were what the army had and what the situation demanded. In the crucible of war, where theoretical elegance matters far less than practical effectiveness, they proved that resolve and flexibility could turn even imperfect tools into instruments of victory. That lesson, more than any specific vehicle or organizational chart, remains the enduring contribution of the American tank destroyer force to the art of modern warfare.